And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Tobias Churton back with us, born in England in 1960. He's got a master's degree in theology. He has completed his 27th commissioned book. He concerns the books of Enoch and the origins of Jewish mysticism and Christianity. Filmmaker, scriptwriter, lecturer, composer of music. Tobias is also the author of the authoritative 6-volume biography of Aleister Crowley, as well as biographies of mystic William Blake and others. Here he is back on Coast to Coast. Tobias, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you, George. Very good to be among you again.
It's good to be back with you. You know, when I was a kid, I always thought alchemists simply tried to make gold out of nothing. I have since learned that's not the case, is it?
That's certainly not the case, though like you, I was fascinated when I was a boy by the image of the alchemist. It's a very compelling image. This lonely sort of Merlin-like character in a sort of cavernous laboratory with bubbling stuff going on like the old Frankenstein movies and all of that stuff. I mean, it's a wonderful image, and it's always difficult to break an image that's become lodged in people's minds. But I wanted to know what alchemy really was. How did it start? What were they actually doing? Is there any truth behind the mythology and so forth? I didn't know. I couldn't find a book that gave you the actual facts. Awful lot of interpretation, lot of speculation in many, many books. And I think I was like so many people, really rather confused about it. And when you get confused, you eventually lose interest. So I wasn't quite sure whether we were talking about an early chemistry, or we're talking about a spiritual discipline or something like this. So I went back to the original documents, the ones that have survived. Mm-hmm. And what I found was really enlightening to me and a joy to discover.
Were they scientists? What did you uncover?
Well, I think what we're looking at between the 1st century of the Christian era and the 4th century of the Christian era, we're seeing a kind of minor industrial revolution going on in Upper Egypt around the city of Panopolis. It's now called Akhmim, which is a couple of hundred miles down the Nile from Cairo, in the area that's called the Thebaid, which means it's near the old Thebes of ancient Egypt. And these were people, it's still a center of textile industry, and it was 2,000 years ago as well. And with certain industrial developments like the appearance of blown glass, which to my amazement only ever appeared in the 1st century BC, the technology was available to make dyes of a very complex for the time character. And so your original alchemist is a metallurgical chemist. That's what he is. Or I should say she is, because in fact we've got more evidence of women masters of this art, or holy and noble art they call it, than we have of men. It seems to have attracted women, especially from Jewish women who were living in Egypt, in Alexandria and in Upper Egypt. And it was marvelous to look in detail at the documents which have been discovered in that part of Egypt, which were written in about the 4th century, but the original documents were probably written in about the 1st century, about the time of Jesus or just a bit before.
Were they well received, Tobias? The alchemists, were they well received in those days?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Of course, as I say, they weren't called alchemists. This is one of the big problems, is this word alchemy suggests a clear difference between alchemy and chemistry.
Right.
I.e., one is a science and one is thought to be hokum or misleading. But the word alchemy is simply the English transliteration of the Arabic alchemia, and which only appears in the 7th century, long after the heyday of these people. And so when that word went into the English language, the word was alchemy from the Arabic, but they didn't call it that in those days. It was called chemia or kumia, and that's the origin of our word chemistry. So we're talking about chemistry, and it comes from both the Egyptian and the Hebrew word for black, which could mean the old soil of Egypt because they had the annual flooding and inundation. But I think it's more to do with the effect of burning. I think it's the art of roasting, the art of heat. And I think the original meaning of chemistry is the art of heat. What happens when you subject substances to the action of heat? And hence the black art, because when you roast something, you see that it goes black, as your chicken does, or turkey, if you overcook it. So it's a carbonized substance, and that's the art of how to control heat.
What was
to use it?
What was their role in the ancient days? What as chemists? What did they try to do?
Well, they weren't writing chemistry books, and they weren't interested in theoretical science as so much of our science is today. They were very practical people who wanted to make a living from dyes. It's really an enrichment, a massive enrichment of dyeing techniques. So when they talked about yellowing and whitening, which was later much misunderstood, yellowing meant to create a gold dye which would pass as gold, and whitening meant to make a silver dye which would pass as silver. And the objects they were making, which were, we know that one of our people talks about making statues, some of religious objects, but also fake, or they weren't thought of as fake, but they were emeralds and diamonds and rubies, by using dyes on stones and using chemistry to apply effective dyes. Now, everyone thinks that gold was the most valuable thing in the ancient world, and the idea of turning lead into gold seems dominated the perception of what they were doing. But that wasn't the case. If you had a lump of gold and you had a beautiful statue next to it, in a marketplace in the Roman times, they'd probably spend more money, as it were, on the statue that was decorated by an artist than, say, a lump of gold, if you get my drift. I'm saying it's how people valued things. And if it looked like gold, people were happy that it was gold. They didn't have our interest in chemical elements, you know, and there was no gold standard. Obviously, coinage had to be gold, and they could test whether it was gold to a certain degree, real gold. But they were interested in the magical effect of the golden and silver color and the way they glitter. So, you know, all that glitters for them could be gold.
Is there anybody today practicing what they did in the ancient days?
Well, I would say, in reality, every industry today which creates a synthetic project, whether it's a sort of a fake leather sofa, we call them fakes, but I mean, leather-looking, but not leather, or things that look metallic but actually are plastic, and so forth. They are doing exactly the principle of what these people in the late Roman Empire were doing, with the difference that we don't have a symbolic understanding of our industrial processes, where in Upper Egypt in this period, one of the great exponents of the art, Zosimus of Panopolis, he saw in this process a kind of divine scheme. He saw in practicing this chemistry, he thought he was seeing the way the mind of God acted in the universe, and he saw his practice of dyeing as a microcosm of the way God manifested spirit and the souls in the universe. So if I give you an example,
sure.
We today take the idea of evaporation and distillation for granted. Everyone who makes whiskey knows all about a distillery. Well, there was no such thing as this until around the first century. They could make a long glass tube for the vapor of the materials to rise up, and it would rise up, and then it would distill on what they called a keratakis, which was a plate, and it would manifest as something different. And of course, he and others saw this as an analogy for the fate of the soul, that through the bitter experiences of life, through the burning, through the roasting, through the anguish of existence, something can be created if there's a process of purification that will manifest as a refined, purified being at another level, at a higher level. You can think of the ascension of the story of the ascension ascension of Jesus on this level, or the ascension of any of these holy men that apparently rose in some way, that they've become part of, quote, heaven or a spiritual world through a process of rising. So when Zosimus looked into his chemical equipment, he saw a divine mystery, and for him that was the compensation, as it were, for the base and human and worldly element of making money out of this chemistry. And he said, if the practitioner was not himself made good and holy by the practice, he's missing the whole point. So that's the kind of engagement with nature that we don't see today. People making industrial processes don't think of themselves, generally speaking, as doing something which could be a spiritual discipline. They just think of the bottom line and the profit and loss.
Did any of these, and we're going to use the word alchemists for ancient times, dabble in any kind of black magic or anything like that?
Oh, definitely. There were practitioners who believed that you couldn't do these things without the help of the demons. And Zosimus writes wonderfully eloquent attacks on practitioners who, in his terms, enslaved the practitioner through a kind of pact with demons. And it was thought that the day was divided up into series of what were called decans, and every minute of the day had a controlling demon. And some of these people in Egypt thought that if you wanted the benefit of that daimonic power in your alchemy, then you had to make some sort of prayer towards, or some sort of offering towards this imagined daimonic being. And Zosimus, writing in about 300 AD, says this is nonsense. Alchemy is for everybody. It's part of the divine scheme. It comes from God. You don't have to get into pacts with these scurrilous creatures, these spiritual creatures, these daimons, which practically everybody in this period believed controlled the world invisibly. And Zosimus himself believed that alchemy had come to earth originally with the fallen angels that we read about in the book of Enoch, which is a book that Zosimus knew very well and writes about it. And he says he had a wonderful relationship with a lady alchemist called Theosophical, and he warns her. He said, "You're turning this into a set of secrets with adepts who are sworn to secrecy and are getting involved in this magical stuff." He said, all you're doing is repeating the fault of the people who were seduced by the angels of Azael. And so while he believed that the technique of alchemy had been brought to earth from a higher level, because it comes originally from God, he strongly believed, he said that it's the way it's used that matters.
But they did dabble a lot in mysticism, right?
Oh, they didn't dabble. They were. I mean, mysticism, as we understand it, was completely of the culture of late Roman Empire, especially where we're talking about Roman Egypt or Greco-Roman Egypt. They spoke Greek mostly. And yes, the people then and today have a magical conception of life. So obviously, not everybody was as intellectually enlightened and advanced as Zosimus. So yes, it got a reputation for being, in later years, of course, we hear the word the black art, meaning something that's hidden, but people thought it was maybe evil because this is a technology that very few people understood or could deal with. And obviously, like today, you get practitioners of processes who use it for good, and there are those who use it for wicked,
for bad,
evil acts. And so there's always this ambiguity with science, always, today as then, that it's the intention and the state of heart of the practitioner that makes all the difference as to whether a technology is good or bad. We now have this with artificial intelligence. We have a major problem. We have a technology which is super powerful, potentially ruinous, but it also has potentially beneficial effects. And poor old man, as usual, stuck torn between the two choices, and many obviously will give in to temptation.
Did any of them dabble with herbs and medicinal things too?
I think the early chemical practitioners were quite distinct in what they were doing. All the extant evidence, there are two papyri called the Leiden papyrus and the Stockholm papyrus, which give a list of several hundred recipes for alchemical operations, and it's pretty well always to do with making dyes for emeralds, rubies, etc., and for making gold dyes and silver dyes, and for making purple dyes for wool. And they're quite specific about that. And while they shared knowledge with the doctors of the time, the pharmacists and so forth, they were very much involved with the industry, I think, rather than trying to be jacks of all trades. Now, you're probably implying something like the elixir of life.
Yes.
And the elixir it's another Arabic word. It's something that comes in much later, when the documents of this early period, which I've been studying, were taken by the Arab scientists and mixed in with medicinal law. So you then get a mixture that you get this implication that there's a connection between chemistry and alchemy. And in the West, in Western Europe, that reaches its peak in about 1500, when the Swiss doctor Paracelsus introduces chemistry to medicine, which is the beginning of the drugs industry that we know today. You go to a doctor today and you will get an alchemical preparation in the terms of the Arab alchemists. So that is a later development, is the idea that these are not only for decoration and a process of some spiritual yoga in a way, but there's also could be health benefits from some of these chemically concocted substances.
I love the artistic rendition of the cover on the first Alchemists with the human skull on the guy's desk and everything else. Well done.
Yeah, it looks rather, to me, rather sort of a shady business, you know.
It does,
behind closed doors and mysterious and shadowy. And I hope that when you open the book and read it carefully and take your time with it, that in fact that room will become full of light.
They were amazing people. They were amazing people, weren't they?
I think I obviously believe so. I think they were, in some respects of their thinking, were slightly in advance of ourselves, but we also have the legacy. But I think what's happened in the processes of time, documents which had a very specific meaning in these Roman times have been vastly misunderstood. And there are very concrete reasons which I was able to trace of how these perversions, if you like, have come in, like the idea of the Philosopher's Stone and things like that. It basically, when the documents were passed on, when the industry was no more, they were interpreted as if they were mystical documents and radically misunderstood. So a lot of medieval alchemy, which is the stuff most people have heard about, or the Renaissance alchemy, was based on a false understanding of what the documents were actually alluding to.
Good point. Tobias, we're going to take a short break. We'll come right back and chat more. Plus, I want to talk about your autobiographies and biographies that you've written about Aleister Crowley. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie back with Tobias Churton. Tobias, the book, The First Alchemists, where do people buy it?
Well, yeah, at your Barnes & Noble store or Amazon, or I think my website gives the indication of how to connect directly with Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or yes, any good bookstore.
Excellent. But you believe the alchemists who are modern-day chemists today are out here trying to do all kinds of things, aren't they? Pharmaceuticals, you name it.
Yes. I mean, we are talking about the origins of chemistry, chemical science. And that's gone in so many different directions. But probably there's been a revival over the last years, but, I don't know if it's just since the war. I think there's been a long revival of an older idea of alchemy, which is this notion that you can use it as a spiritual discipline, as well as in contact with things that help growth in nature and organics, and just genuinely the belief that there are certain properties in certain plants which ordinary science doesn't recognize. And that would come under the rubric today of sort of a kind of modern alchemy.
Right. You wrote
There are many different branches to this field.
The tentacles go everywhere, don't they?
I think so, even into psychology and personal development, yes.
You wrote a 6-volume...
We're organic beings, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Now, you wrote a 6-volume biography of Aleister Crowley. He was an occultist. Was he evil?
No, not at all. If by evil you mean somebody addicted to wickedness and hurting and causing pain and serving the dark side of either his or another being's nature. I investigated the largest collections of his writings, his handwritings, his letters, in great detail, and I couldn't find any evidence for a psychotic tendency. I never had this feeling. I don't know if you've ever read books about criminals, really serious criminals, mass murderers, and so forth. I had, I think a lot of young people, I had a period in my youth when I did read about murders and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I always had this sort of horrible, clammy feeling, like a horrible thing, something I wanted to get away from, something wicked, evil, perverse, dark, and insidious, and all of that. I never, ever had that feeling reading Crowley's writings and his letters. Quite the opposite. Often it was a kind of cleansing feeling. The trouble is, his image is so pervasive that most newspapers do not want to know the truth about Aleister Crowley because the myth is so much more useful to them. I mean, I just did a piece for... I was involved with a chap who was researching 6-part series for Le Monde, one of the greatest newspapers in France. And it was a summer series, 6 parts on Aleister Crowley. And he wrote to me asking questions. I wrote back and gave him everything help I could possibly give him. And then the piece comes out, and here we get it all over again. Aleister Crowley, wicked man, founder of bad rock and roll, and perverter of Ozzy Osbourne and Led Zeppelin, and all this stuff comes out again. I thought, can't you read, mate? And it was just he knew what made a good story. And the story and myth of Crowley overpowers the truth. But I and I don't think I'm alone, I'm interested in what the truth was. And the truth is complicated and at the same time extraordinarily fascinating. I don't even know if words like occultist really are right for Crowley. He didn't like the word himself. He had more enemies among the occultists than anywhere else. His big opponents were the Theosophical movement for all sorts of reasons. But,
why were they out to get him, Tobias? I mean, what happened to his image?
Well, what happened to... Well, really, the real question is what happened to the Theosophical Society. Crowley had enormous admiration for its founder, Madame Helena Blavatsky, and he thought she was a real sort of messenger for mankind. But after she died in 1892, if memory serves, the movement bifurcated slightly and was eventually taken over by a guy called Ledbetter and especially an English political activist called Annie Besant. And they, between them, set up an organization to raise an Indian boy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, into a world messiah. And Crowley profoundly objected to this idea that this boy, that Ledbetter, who was later in trouble for sleeping with boys, that this boy raised to be the Messiah could be taken seriously. And when he directly opposed the movement, it was called the Alcyone Project, he invited a lot of hate. of course, Crowley's point was if there was going to be a Messiah, it was him. So he strongly believed that he'd been reluctantly presented with a message for mankind. And this is where the real complexity of Crowley comes in, because while he was a highly intelligent person and a scientific mentality, he had this experience and a series of experiences principally in Cairo in 1904, where he felt he'd been given a document that indicated the future and proper direction of humanity. And people who knew him well, like Gerald York, who was a country gentleman, intellectual, wealthy fellow, who supported Crowley with pocket money, you could say, in his old age. He said there were always two Crowleys. There was this rather brilliant conversationalist, and then there was always the lurking Messiah in there as well. And York didn't accept Crowley as a Messiah, and Crowley accepted that. He said, I don't want you to believe. The last thing I want is believers. You've got to look at what I'm presenting to you. If it means something to you, it means something to you. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And he always said his life was strangely interrupted by this contact, he believed, with what they called the secret chiefs. And a being that his wife said his name was Aiwass, who could manifest to him, and constituted, he believed, his true self or holy guardian angel. And this gets into quite complicated mysticism and the belief that our real being is in another dimension.
Did he know that he had, Tobias, a bad image?
Oh God, yes. And he was a very proud man, and for many years, he just brushed it off as, oh, well, what do you expect the ignorant people to think? Of course, he never read newspapers. He believed that if you wanted the truth, the last place to look was a newspaper. So he had contempt for the things that were written about him, until it reached a point in 1923, he was expelled from Italy by Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator.
Yeah.
And at that point, he had to split from his family, who were in Cefalù in Sicily, and his life became impossible, and he was starving in Tunisia. And while the world's cheaper newspapers were saying, he's the most evil man in the world, well, this most evil man in the world was suffering terribly from asthma, bronchitis, and an addiction to heroin, which was prescribed for his asthma. And he was in terrible circumstances. And then he tried to launch a newspaper campaign and got various notable people to write something in his favor. The newspapers were not interested in the campaign, and he never had the money to conduct a proper libel trial. In 1934, 11 years later, he said enough was enough after a book came out saying he was sort of murdering children. And when that came out, he sued the publisher, and his girlfriend at the time paid the money for his lawyer. And the trial, which I detail in one of my books, Aleister Crowley in England, was an absolute travesty. And his reputation returned to bite him, and he lost the case and became bankrupt for the rest of his life. I think if he'd been wicked and evil, as people say, he'd have made a much more successful job defending himself.
You might be right.
He was rather guileless. He was brought up by a father who'd started life as a Quaker, and his whole religious background was an austere Protestant background. His father was a freelance preacher for the Plymouth Brethren, which was a movement that came out of nonconformist Protestantism in Ireland in the 19th century, and they believed in the literal truth of the Bible. So Crowley was brought up believing every single word of the King James Bible was God's own actual words. And when he found out that in later life that this was not only not the case, but there was another kind of life to be lived outside of this Christian sect, he rebelled against Christianity, and I think that's the other reason he has a terrible reputation, because he was very free in his criticisms of certain Christian beliefs, especially ones about atonement through blood sacrifice. He believed that this was a sort of primitive magic, which didn't belong in a scientific era. So, his mother would write to him and say, "My dear son, you should be washed in the blood of the lamb." And he'd just sort of feel a bit sick. And yet he was always looking for, as it were, a true religion. And his system of Thelema is a synthesis which has quite a lot of Christian moral elements in it, but it also elements from Sufism and Buddhism and Advaitist Hinduism, and it's a sort of a Gnostic synthesis of the scientific idea of enlightenment, that you can be enlightened through following a scientific path of self-development. And in fact, there are umpteen groups like that now all over the place, trying to say that the way out of your problems is to attain divine enlightenment.
Would you say he was spiritual, Tobias?
Oh, incredibly. I mean, he had very little interest in material things. I mean, he lived in a large part of his life was lived quite close to material poverty. He started life very rich. He inherited a fortune from his father when he was 21, and he spent it on largely on world travel, exploring religions around the world, traveling to the east, and 2 massive mountaineering expeditions, which were pioneering ones, and on producing fine books, which he produced. And by the time of the First World War, he'd practically run out of money and had to mortgage his house. And when he went to America in 1914, I think he had about £250 left, and that was soon spent in New York, as you can imagine.
He died in 72 back in England, didn't he?
He died in 47.
Yeah, he was 72 years old.
He was 72 years old, yes, and he used to get his heroin from the doctor, Dr. McGowan in Hastings, which was the only relief he got from his extreme asthmatic condition. So he wasn't a drug addict in the junkie sense of a self-indulgent dope smoker and all the rest of it, but he was interested in psychedelic experimentation. He was an outsider with a lot of ideas that have been taken up since, often not credited to him. Some of his writings are marvelous. Some of his poetry is exceptionally good. Some of it is not particularly good. He was a compelling writer. I just wanted to set the record straight, rather than. I'm not interested in whitewashing any human being, because nobody I've met has attained the perfection which we might dream of, and everybody has weaknesses. But he was never committed. I think the nearest commitment to a crime he ever was involved with was because he did shut his blackout windows in 1943 in Torquay. I think he was paid a fine. He had to pay a fine for not... because of the war, German bombers.
Right,
you had to close your windows. That's the only time he was arraigned for a crime. And Scotland Yard had every reason to investigate him. He was completely cleared by the head of the special branch in 1929, and the government had nothing on him at all. But still these stories come out, and they entice and in some ways they get people to look into the truth, and some people see through the murk and get to the good side of Crowley, the interesting side and the creative side. And some people are just happy to say, oh, he's the devil's own and part of the great conspiracy against the Holy Church.
Did people like him when they met him?
Oh, gosh, yes. He was a very magnetic personality. Obviously, not everybody liked him. Some people instinctively were frightened of him, partly because they'd heard his reputation. Women generally were attracted to him, and his friends tended to be artists, male and female, artists, scientists. He met Aldous Huxley in Berlin. He was familiar with some of the leading particle physics scientists in Berlin in the 30s. Most people who met him were charmed by him, and the moment anyone felt that, usually they'd get a letter from some person saying, "You mustn't mix with Crowley. He's bad news. He's a dark person."
They're out to get him.
So there was a kind of constant. He came to wonder in the 30s whether or not some of his outrageous statements at Cambridge in the Edwardian era had outraged some great English family who'd basically put some money aside to persecute him through his life.
Well, that could have happened. We're going to come back, Tobias, and chat more and take questions with you, so just hang on.